Hello and welcome back to the Electronic Intifada's live stream for Thursday, February 27th. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleagues Ali Abunimah, Jon Elmer, Asa Winstanley, and Tamara Nassar. It's day 40 of the ceasefire following 15 months of Israel's genocide in Gaza. Coming up, we'll speak with author Yves Engler, who recently spent 5 days in a jail in Montreal, Canada, in what appears to be yet another case of retaliation and repression against a supporter of Palestinian rights. Asa will talk about the BBC and its new documentary on Gaza's children that it took down after an intense campaign by anti-Palestinian activists in Britain with close ties to the Israeli state. And later on in the program, Jon will break down the 7th prisoner exchange of Phase 1 of the ceasefire in Rafah and Nuseirat. But first, here's a brief summary of some of the latest developments this week in Palestine. Early this morning, after a 5-day delay by the Israeli government, more than 600 Palestinian women, children, and men were released from Israeli detention back to their loved ones in Gaza and the occupied West Bank or exiled to neighboring countries. Reporting from Gaza on the scene at the European hospital in Khan Yunis, where the released Palestinian hostages underwent medical checks, Al Jazeera's Tariq Abu Azzoum said that, quote, "We have seen a number of Palestinian prisoners who lost their limbs, and others are suffering from severe injuries to their bodies due to the aggressive torture that took place in Israeli detention camps and centers. Lots of them, as we have been sharing conversations with them, confirmed that they have witnessed some of the worst methods of torture at the hands of the Israeli occupation forces." Jon will have more on the prisoner exchanges later on in the program. In Gaza, 7 infants died this week from hypothermia as winter temperatures dropped and as Israel has continued to restrict or delay the entry of necessary caravans, tents, and heavy machinery to clear rubble as agreed upon under the January 19th ceasefire terms. The United Nations Office for Human Rights in Palestine said on Wednesday that 3 of the babies were newborns between 1 and 2 days old. A Palestinian health official speaking to Reuters said that in the past 2 weeks, 8 newborns were admitted to hospitals with severe cold-related injuries. One infant, a 2-month-old girl, died of hypothermia on Tuesday in her family's tent at Al-Mawasi Khan Yunis, and her body was received at the nearby Nasser Hospital. The infant's father, Yusuf al-Shinbat, told reporters that, quote, "I unbuttoned her clothes and patted her, but there was no breath or heartbeat. Yesterday, I was playing with her, bathing her. I was happy with her. She was a beautiful child, like the moon." Our contributor Abu Bakr Abed filmed himself walking through the rubble in Khan Yunis on Tuesday. He describes the destruction and how people are surviving in the freezing cold temperatures.
This is life in Khan Yunis. People in the background are sitting on a tent over the rubble of their homes because they don't have enough space, and at the same time they don't have any choices because Israel continues blocking the entry of caravans and mobile homes into Gaza, which doubles people's suffering every single day. I'm here over one of the mountains of rubble in central Khan Yunis, and this particular area has completely been destroyed by the Israeli military. Nothing has been, nothing has escaped Israeli attacks at all. And just like this is central Khan Yunis at the moment. The skyline view is total destruction. I can see the far regions of the southern Gaza Strip from here. You can see probably in the background how the destruction is. It's utterly unfathomable.
That was Abu Bakr Abed reporting from Khan Yunis. The Gaza City municipality reported this week that a major campaign was underway to collect and remove solid waste from the streets and neighborhoods around the city. The municipality said that, quote, Gaza City is experiencing a major health and environmental disaster due to the accumulation of approximately 170,000 tons of waste in the streets. They added that about 80% of their heavy machinery was destroyed by the Israeli army. A new report on Israel's systematic policies of abduction, torture, and killing of medical professionals in Gaza was released yesterday by Physicians for Human Rights Israel. It includes detailed testimonies that the organization has gathered from 24 medical professionals who were detained, abused, and tortured. The testimonies, which I won't read from here because of their disturbing and explicit nature, highlight Israel's systematic policies of inhumane treatment of Palestinians and the countless violations of international human rights law. PHRI says that 23 of the 24 health workers they interviewed were taken to the notorious Sidi Tayman detention camp. From the moment of their arrest in Gaza, PHRI says, medical workers, through transportation and later in Israeli detention facilities, detainees endure physical, psychological, and sexual abuse, as well as starvation and medical neglect amounting to torture. The organization adds that, quote, the accounts gathered in this report reveal a grim reality of relentless, severe, and cruel mistreatment, including verbal, physical, and sexual abuse. Quote, almost 150 medical workers are still incarcerated under these conditions and can still be saved if enough pressure is put on the Israeli government to release them. They are detained because they are Palestinians, because they are from Gaza, but also and importantly because they are healthcare workers. We've published many features on the Electronic Intifada in the last week, but we wanted to highlight excerpts of Miraculous Escape for Baby Found in Tree by Shaima Eid, writing from Gaza. Shaima writes, quote, Omar was missing. Rescue crews searched for hours, thinking the body of the 2-month-old baby boy was buried under the rubble of his father's house in the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 area in Khan Yunis, which had just been hit in an airstrike. Their luck was out. They told his surviving family they believed he had not survived. But then a neighbor heard groaning and crying from an olive tree nearby. He looked up. There was little Omar hanging from a branch. It was December 7th, 2023. A tough day, according to journalist Bassel al-Saka, Omar's uncle. Today, the boy lives with his grandmother, Itaf, and Bassel in a tent in the Al-Mawasi area of Khan Yunis. Omar's parents, older brother, and 7 other people were killed in the Israeli attack. But that December day, the family was trying to comprehend the shocking news. We lived hours of anxiety after the neighbors informed us that my brother's house had been bombed, Bassel told the Electronic Intifada in February. After the civil defense teams left and the sound of their digging through rubble stopped, relative calm returned to the area, and then the shock occurred. The neighbor who spotted the boy contacted emergency medical workers. They took Omar to the Nasser Medical Complex. Miraculously, doctors determined that he was fine and free of injuries. No one could believe it, but Bassel and his mother, who had been displaced just 2 days before the attack from their home in Hamad City, immediately took the boy into their care. According to the UN, some 17,000 children have been orphaned in Israel's genocidal aggression, losing either one or both of their parents. Many of these have been left unaccompanied, with no surviving relatives to care for them. Omar has been relatively fortunate in that respect, though Bassel confessed that raising a baby with his mother was not easy at times. We try to provide the boy with a sense of security, Bassel said. I treat him like my own son. But for all they play with Omar and provide for his needs, neither are under any illusion that they can give the boy the same tenderness as his parents. Sometimes when he cries at night, I feel helpless, Itaf said. I know he's looking for his mother and he will never find her. That's an excerpt from Shaima Eid's feature, Miraculous Escape for Baby Found in Tree on electronicintifada.net. Turning to the occupied West Bank, my colleague Tamara Nassar reports that, quote, Israel is implementing in the occupied West Bank what it has done in historic Palestine since the state's inception, forcibly removing Palestinians from their homes and barring them from returning. The following is from Tamara's report. Approximately 40,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced from refugee camps in the occupied West Bank, with only 3,000 returned, amid what Israel is dubbing the Iron Wall military assault, which has entered its second month. Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz is now indicating that their displacement is permanent, as he instructed the Israeli military to not allow residents to return. The Jenin refugee camp, a focus of the operation, is now virtually empty, Reuters reported, as Israeli forces, quote, appear to be carving wide roadways through its once crowded warren of alleyways. This resembles a tactic Israel used in Gaza, widening roads to facilitate the invading troops' movement through the area and to surveil and strike Palestinian fighters who can use the camp's alleyways to escape Israeli reconnaissance. Israeli tanks were deployed in the West Bank for the first time in approximately 2 decades, another sign of Israel's escalation. The military operation in the West Bank was launched days after the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas was implemented. It was framed to Israel's right-wing base as a continuation of the war to pacify their opposition to the ceasefire agreement. Meanwhile, at least 16 Palestinian children have been killed in the occupied West Bank since the beginning of the year. Half of them were killed by drone strikes. An Israeli soldier in a heavily armored vehicle opened fire from a distance of about 50 meters on February 21st at a 13-year-old girl standing in the courtyard of her family home, shooting her in the back, according to a field investigation by Defense for Children International Palestine. Remas Omar Amouri's family tried to approach her to help, but soldiers fired at them too. Another child, 12-year-old Ayman Nasser Taysir al-Hamouni, was near the home of a family member in the Al-Qasara area south of Hebron on the same day when he was shot in the back by an Israeli soldier inside a heavily armored military vehicle about 200 meters away, DCIP reported. For much more on the situation in the West Bank, read Tamara Nassar's report, Israel Pounds West Bank Children and Infrastructure on electronicintifada.net. Meanwhile, Israeli settlers attacked Palestinian shepherds southeast of Bethlehem on Wednesday, according to Wafa news agency. The head of the local village council said that a group of settlers invaded the lands, forced the shepherds out, and set up 2 tents nearby, along with grazing cattle, as a way to establish a colonial outpost. Israeli forces expanded their ongoing attack on Masafar Yatta, south of Hebron, this week. On Wednesday, Israeli soldiers demolished nearly 20 tents full of people's belongings and destroyed the water and electricity networks in the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐿 community of Masafar Yatta. Mohammed Badawi, one of the affected residents, told the Wafa news agency that the occupation forces demolished the tents that housed more than 10 families who took refuge in those tents after the occupation had demolished their homes earlier this month, leaving more than 80 individuals, most of them women and children, homeless. Israeli forces had demolished more than 17 homes and a number of caves in that area over the last month, 7 of them in 𝐓𝐡 𝐿 alone. This video is from February 10th, as Israeli forces bulldozed people's homes in the village. Wafa reported that Israeli occupation authorities also razed land and uprooted olive trees in the town of Beit Iksa, northwest of Jerusalem. Finally, as we always do, we wanted to share images of people expressing determination and resilience in the aftermath of Israel's 15-month genocide. Schools across Gaza reopened this week, many for the first time since October 2023. This photo was posted by the Quds news network showing students in class at the Rufaida school in Deir Balah. Al Jazeera's Anas al-Sharif reported from Al Nasser School in Gaza City as well, where he says 300 children came to restart their educations. He says the school was bombed several times during the genocide and the Israeli army committed massacres inside the school, but the students wanted to return to education again. Despite the tragic circumstances, he says, this was the first day of school inside the Gaza Strip.
إليها أكثر من 300 طالب ليتعلموا في داخل هذه المدرسة. هذه المدرسة تعرضت للقصف عدة مرات، وجيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ارتكب عدة مجازر في داخل هذه المدرسة، لكن هؤلاء الطلاب أرادوا أن يعودوا من جديد للتعليم رغم الظروف المأساوية الصعبة. اليوم الأول للتعليم في داخل قطاع غزة، ربما هؤلاء الأطفال منهم من
That was Anas Al-Sharif. And a pharmacist and writer, Omar Hamad, with his friend, filmed themselves in a field in Beit Hanun in northern Gaza, where spring flowers and plants have started to grow and bloom.
We have returned to our land, our beautiful paradise, Beit Hanun. We will replant it and bring it back to life once again.
And that's it for the news roundup. As always, go to electronicintifada.net for much more, especially to read our new features by our brave writers in Gaza. You're watching the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleague Ali Abunimah. Hi, Ali.
Hi, Nora. Thank you so much for that. It's
of course.
There's still so much difficult news, and we have such a job to make sure it stays at the top of people's minds. But it's wonderful at last to see the prisoners coming home, albeit many of them in really difficult health situations.
Awful health situations, yeah.
But that is something to celebrate.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, all these children too. I was just struck again by how many children Israel has detained and keeps detaining and arrests over and over again, and to see them being embraced by their parents who have just been through hell every single waking hour that their children have been taken from them by Israel, and to see the parents returning to embrace their children after they were in prison. Just the whole thing is just... It's so painful and it's so moving to see these reunions, and we hope that that all of them are released, of course.
And the thing to remember about child prisoners, Palestinian child prisoners, of course, everything Israel does has been put on steroids since October 7th. Yeah. But for decades, Israel has been the only country in the world that routinely subjects children, only Palestinian children, mind you, to military tribunals and to military prisons, and hundreds of children every year. And that was going on for decades, long before October 7th. And it was just considered normal. That never stopped Western politicians from saying we have shared values with Israel and it's a democracy like us. The fact that there was a systematic mass imprisonment of Palestinian children for decades never bothered them. Never.
No. In fact,
it still doesn't.
Business as usual. Exactly.
Still doesn't. Nobody. There's no coverage of the Palestinian children in Western media.
No, not at all. And the little that there is, it is swiftly censored and taken down, as Asa will talk about later on. Well,
but
we have.
Speaking of censorship.
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead.
It's a theme.
Yes.
Let's get right into it. And I know that. Well, let me just remind people, of course, that they are listening to and watching the Electronic Intifada live stream, and I'm here with my colleague Nora Barrows-Friedman. And many of our viewers will know that Canadian author Yves Engler was released on Monday after spending 5 days in a jail in Montreal in what appears to be another case of retaliation and repression against a supporter of Palestinian rights. Yves was initially charged with harassment in connection with social media posts criticizing 𝐄𝐥𝐿 𝐄𝐥𝐿, an influencer notorious for using social media accounts to spread hatred against Palestinians and Muslims, as well as to disseminate debunked October 7th atrocity propaganda used in attempts to justify Israel's genocide in Gaza. After police called Yves Engler and informed him of his impending arrest, he went online to refute the accusations of harassment. On dozens of occasions, I've responded to Kurtz's racist, violent, anti-Palestinian posts on X, Engler wrote on his website. Because of that post, police then claimed that Yves Engler was also harassing the police and added a whole series of new charges. These events are described by Owen Schalk in an article published this week by the Electronic Intifada. The group PEN Canada, a group that defends freedom of expression, wrote a letter to Montreal Police Chief Fadi Daher and Montreal Mayor Valérie Plante expressing concern over the violation of Engler's rights. The group stated, quote, PEN Canada takes the position that it is not a crime to take a pro-Palestinian stance in public. It is not a crime to object to those who support Israel's actions or to describe them as fascists. It is not a crime to criticize or condemn the state of Israel. It is not a crime to write that Israel's actions in Gaza are genocide. To object in print or otherwise to others who support Israel's actions is not a threat to any individual or to the police. And Alex Tyrrell, leader of the Green Party of Quebec, described Engler's jailing as a shocking attack on free expression and democratic rights and criticism of Israel in Canada, a country that's supposed to be a free, democratic society. So who is Yves Engler? He's the author of 13 books, including Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy, his latest co-authored with Owen Schalk, and Canada and Israel Building Apartheid. Yves Engler not only speaks truth to power through his books and writings, including many articles for the Electronic Intifada, he also regularly speaks truth right into the faces of the powerful themselves. And there are dozens of videos of Yves directly confronting political leaders over their support for Israel's crimes. And I would like to just take a look at a few of them. And the first one here, this is Yves Engler confronting Canadian Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly on November 3rd, 2023.
Madame Joly, why are you enabling Israel's crimes against Palestinians? You have blood on your hand, Madame Joly. You went to Israel to support what the massacres, more than 4,000 Palestinian children killed. Madame Joly, tu devrais avoir honte. T'as le sang des Palestiniens sur tes mains. Madame Joly, tu devrais avoir honte. Tu soutiens les massacres palestiniens contre les Palestiniens. Plus que 4,000 enfants morts, Madame Joly.
And the next one is Yves Engler confronting Chrystia Freeland in April 2024 when she was Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Canada.
You condemn Israel's killing of 14,000 children? Minister Freeland, you condemn Israel's killing of 14,000 children. Excuse me, stop blocking me. Do you condemn Israel's killing of 14,000 children? Minister Freeland, why are you just walking away? Do you condemn the killing? Do you call for a two-way arms embargo?
And let's take a look now at a video from March 2024 of Yves Engler directly confronting I shouldn't say Governor Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
No. Out. Mr. Trudeau, you're enabling a genocide! Mr. Trudeau! You're enabling a genocide! Mr. Trudeau! Why are you enabling a genocide in Gaza, Mr. Trudeau?
And this was going to be the last one, but I added one more, so we're going to do two more quickly. This is Yves speaking to Valérie Plante, the mayor of Montreal.
Madame Plante, are you willing to condemn Israel's Holocaust in Gaza? Madame Plante, you condemned October 7th, Madame Plante. You condemned October 7th. Can you condemn Israel's Holocaust in Gaza? You've criticized the students who oppose the genocide. Madame Plante, can you condemn Israel's Holocaust in Gaza? Just say, I condemn Israel's Holocaust in Gaza. Can you say that? Madame Plante, can you say that? No, arrête de toucher.
And the last one, which I believe Yves just posted yesterday, which I think is good evidence that he has not been scared into silence by his recent experience, shows him confronting Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party and likely the next Prime Minister of Canada. Let's take a look at that.
Mr. Poilievre, do you condemn Trump's plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza? Do you condemn Trump's plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza? Mr. Poilievre, do you condemn the plan? Are you a genocidal Jewish supremacist, Mr. Poilievre? Are you a genocidal Jewish supremacist? Do you want more Palestinian children killed?
Wow. So, as I said, there are actually dozens of these videos that Yves has posted.
It's relentless.
And, yeah, he is absolutely relentless. And so let's bring on the man himself and welcome Yves Engler to the Electronic Intifada live stream.
Hi, Yves.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Hi, Yves. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Great. Well, we're happy to see you released from jail. It seems absolutely surreal that you went to jail over tweets criticizing a notorious supporter of Israeli apartheid and genocide and for criticizing the police. What do you want to tell us about your experience and the status of your case to the extent that you can talk about it?
Well, I think the first thing is it was a small victory for freedom of expression and for campaigning on Palestine. I won, or we won, because it was huge support. The ability to keep talking about the fact that 𝐐𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐿 got the police to charge me for challenging her violent anti-Palestinian posts. It's outrageous. It took 5 days of jail to win this battle over a condition. It has nothing to do with the actual case. That's going to proceed in a couple months. But it's just the ability to talk about it. And so, yeah, basically 𝐄𝐥𝐿, 7 months ago, she did this sort of declaration on X saying that I was harassing her and stopped talking about me, or stopped responding to me, this kind of thing. And but she never blocks me, as someone pointed out right away. Just block him if you don't want him to be able to respond to you. Block him. I've never met her. I've never messaged her. I've never talked to her. I don't follow her on X. So it was very easy for her, but she wanted to set up this sort of legal avenue. And the police went along with it. They initially investigated, open investigation. They closed it. And this prominent lawyer, who's now a conservative candidate in Montreal, Neil Oberman, after he sent a letter supporting 𝐄𝐥𝐿's claims against me, they reopened the investigation, and then they decided to charge me. And when I went public with these charges, the police's reaction was to basically double down and to say that I was now harassing the police. So initially I'm harassing a social media commentator by responding to her posts, and then I'm harassing the police by writing about the fact that I'm being charged for criticizing Israel. Who knows where this will all go? I'm hoping the Crown will ultimately just drop it all. I have a very hard time believing that a judge will find me guilty. But this is the sort of state of the police kind of judicial apparatus, that they are willing to move forward with this obviously kind of absurd campaign to make my life difficult and suppress my ability to talk about these issues.
I mean, do you think that's what the purpose was? And do you think I mean, what are they calculating? Do they not know who? I guess they do know who you are, since you're in their faces a lot of the time. Do you think there was an element here of retaliation because you are constantly holding these politicians to account? Do you think this was targeted retaliation against you?
I think there's no doubt that 𝐐𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐿 and Neil Oberman launched this to basically go after me. There's no doubt about that, of course. I actually challenged Neil Oberman when he brought the injunction, this lawyer who's a conservative candidate here in Montreal, when he brought the injunction against the McGill encampment back in April. I challenged him at the courthouse, and he got very angry at me about this later on. And so he, I was definitely on his radar at that point, if not before. And he's launched like dozens of legal battles against different Palestine-related stuff over the past year or so. So this is what he does. He's a prime example of the lawfare that's being used by Zionist groups, across North America and the world, I guess. So that's definitely now for the Montreal police. Like I said, they opened the investigation. So 𝐄𝐥𝐿 back in the summer brought this evidence of me allegedly harassing her to the police. The police opened an investigation, decided that it didn't warrant charges, and closed the case. Then this Oberman gets involved formally, and then it gets back open. I'm not sure if I think it's likely that the initial police investigator was actually just being kind of lazy. She's under pressure. There's a sort of, there's all this anti-Semitism, these pro-Palestinian mobs, there's all this sort of political rhetoric in the dominant media, particularly Anglophone media here in Montreal. And I'm not sure if what she did was just sort of like pass this along. I don't really want to deal with this. I just pass along to the Crown. The Crown may just drop it. Now, once I publicized this, and specifically this business of this condition that they were trying to impose that said I couldn't talk about the charges against me effectively, I couldn't talk about 𝐓𝐿𝐿 𝐄𝐥𝐿. Once I publicized this, the police's reaction to that, I think, is basically the police just sort of defending their own. Now, I think they're defending their own, but they wouldn't have brought 4 more charges against me for harassing the police if it wasn't a sense that they had a sort of okay within the policing structure to do that, i.e. that I'm obviously on the radar of the Montreal police in a broader level. And so they, decide to sort of throw the book at me in that sense, knowing that there was sort of broader support for doing that within the structure of the Montreal police. So that's my presumption, but I of course don't really know.
Yeah. And there were some elements of your detention that people were pointing out was, they restricted your access to a lawyer. They kept, I think, changing the day or the time of your hearings. Can you tell us a little bit about these, what looked like very punitive measures as you were already in jail?
Yeah. When I showed up on Thursday morning to the detention center, the police office, they could have just arrested me, charged me, fingerprinted, and let me go, right, in 15 minutes. That was actually what the police inspector initially said they were going to do when it was just the charges against 𝐓𝐿𝐿 𝐄𝐥𝐿. It was going to take 15 minutes and then just be on your way. I presented myself. It's not like they were searching me. I live in Montreal. I have 2 young kids. It's not. So they could have done that. The police, as part of the going after me with the added charges as well, they decided they were going to detain me. And the Crown then, I had a video hearing 4 or 5 hours later. The Crown objected to my release. Again, I could have been released then. So then you're in jail. Then the next day, on the Friday, again, the Crown played games with conditions. So we could have had the bail hearing on the Friday. They played games with that, forcing it off until Monday. And as you noted, despite my lawyer on the Friday asking the judge to mandate the jail to allow me to speak with him throughout the weekend to prepare for our defense for the Monday, they absolutely refused. And I pushed the matter repeatedly at the jail, and ultimately just before lockdown on Sunday night, when I really pushed it, I got kind of almost, kind of an argument with the guards on this. They just basically laughed at me like, yeah, right. So what? We don't care. And I don't actually think that was political against me. It was actually political in the broader sense that the policing or the prison structure is totally dehumanizing, and people's rights are sort of thrown out left and right. And I saw that, a lot of that. So, and then there was apparently a bureaucratic error on the Monday. I show up at 7:30 in the morning to the guards saying, why haven't I been taken to the courthouse? which is downtown Montreal. And they say to me, "You're not supposed to go to court until tomorrow." And I was basically certain that was wrong, but I didn't have any formal document, and I sort of pressed it, and they said, "No, we looked into it, it's tomorrow." And I was confused. And then 4 hours later, and this is where the solidarity in the courthouse, and about 100 people showed up in the morning, and this is where the solidarity, I think, really helped. 4 hours later, the judge basically calls the prison and says, "Why isn't the prisoner down here? He was supposed to be here this morning." And because there were so many people that turned out, I think that put added kind of immediacy on the judge to take this question seriously. And so then they forced the court to the prison to send me down to the court, and we were able to have the trial at the end of the day. It should have been in the morning. At the end of the day, and I should also state within this bail hearing, that's all it was that my lawyer didn't even have to present the defense of why this condition was wrong. The judge, just at the end of the Crown laying out their case, the judge basically stepped in and said, "You have to come to some agreement. This makes no sense. You're basically blocking him from being able to talk about this case," and basically forced the Crown to negotiate with my lawyer to something I was willing to agree to. We told them right away that I was willing to basically just myself block 𝐄𝐥𝐿 so I can't respond to any of her comments. But I still have the right to talk about 𝐄𝐿𝐿, still have the right to talk about the case. And basically the Crown was forced to concede to that as the condition, rather than this much broader condition they wanted to impose.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, Yves, many people came down to the courthouse, and thousands of people wrote to the police, to the mayor of Montreal, and to other authorities in your support. And there have been many public statements, which is incredibly important in these situations. It shows the authorities that the person they're targeting is not isolated and is not alone. That's incredibly important. As you know, there is apparently a wave of repression in the West against supporters of Palestinian rights, including crackdowns and criminal charges against students for protesting genocide on their campuses, bans and violent police repression of demonstrations, and arrests and raids on independent journalists and activists. That includes, of course, the British police raid on the home of our Electronic Intifada colleague, Asa Winstanley, last October, when police seized his devices as part of an investigation into his social media postings. There's also been a pattern now of independent journalists and activists being stopped and interrogated at the airport when returning to their home countries. Most recently, this has happened to Max Blumenthal returning to the United States from Nicaragua just a few years ago. And David Miller, who also has written for the Electronic Intifada and is an academic and journalist, was detained under the Terrorism Act for several hours just in the last day or two, returning from Beirut, where he was covering the funeral of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. And we've seen similar things happening with Richard Medhurst, Kit Clarenberg, and we've seen people like Tony Greenstein, an author and activist in the UK, criminally charged, again, over tweets related to Palestine. Yves, do you see what happened to you as being, and I should mention, of course, my own experience in Switzerland a month ago when I was jailed for several days as well, and that case is ongoing. But do you see what happened to you as being part of this bigger pattern of repression? Do you think it's all coordinated?
I don't know if it's all coordinated, but it's certainly part of a broader pattern of repression. On February 13th, I believe it was, I spoke on a webinar with the BC Civil Liberties Association lawyer that was headlined the New McCarthyism in Canada, and basically all about the crackdown against Palestine solidarity in Canada. And there's just like a litany of cases, most of them that got very, very little attention, from a lawyer that was had police come and investigate her question her over some tweets, to the higher profile case of the Indigo 11, who put up posters on a bookstore that the owner of the bookstore funds this fund for lone soldiers, finances non-Israelis joining the Israeli military. And they put up posters. Allegedly, these people put up posters. They got their houses raided in the morning for putting up a political poster, alleged political poster. And 11 of them got charged. The most egregious example of that in Canada is what's happened to Charlotte Cates and the Samidoun Palestinian Political Prisoners Network. Cates is an activist in Vancouver. And a few months ago, the Canadian government actually listed, alongside the US, but I actually think this was a Canadian initiative, listed the Samidoun as a terrorist organization, basically criminalizing the organization having anything to do with it. And I've had a number of discussions with activists in Vancouver about how the police raided, before that, they raided Charlotte Cates' home. And they detained her at a different period, coming off a bus and stuff like that. But then I talked to a bunch of activists in Vancouver, and there's kind of like attack against anyone who's claimed to have any association with Samidoun, and the police, Vancouver police, are sort of interrogating people. Some of the things about there was one of them, American citizen, who was returning to Vancouver to continue working. She had a proper work visa, but they blocked her at the border, and there was all this interrogation around some of the Palestine stuff that she was doing. So there's no doubt, and you see it like little things that a campus like here at Concordia, Montreal. They hired this outside security firm that was set up by a former Israeli soldier who continues to be the head of security for the 𝐓𝐶𝐞, the main Israel lobby group, and they hire his security firm to bring in security agents because the students have voted the General Assembly just a few weeks ago 885 to 58 in support of BDS. It's basically unanimity among students on the issue. And so they respond to this by repression. So we're seeing examples of this all across the country. Now, on this stuff, I find that there's a tension in terms of discussing it, because obviously we need to denounce it, and we have to have complete solidarity with those who are being targeted. But I think there's some element of it. Sometimes the paranoia goes a little too far. I think we still have relatively free societies, and it's important to not go too far in terms of letting it deter us from activity, deter us from campaigning, deter us from being bold, from continuing to take action. So there is some tensions on it. And the other part of it is that the new McCarthyism isn't because the state wanted to. It's because there's this, in Canada, there's never been a greater upsurge of international solidarity than over the past 16 months. There is no example in the history of Canadian foreign policy where there's been more demonstrations, more actions, more disruptions against Canada's complicity in an international crime. And so they are reacting to our strength in one sense, and I think we should realize that, and also use it to broaden the movement. Of course, right? The broaden the fight for against the genocide is also a fight for free expression, and to sort of bring that together to sort of broaden political support.
Mm. Let's get into kind of the larger picture in terms of Canada's relationship to Israel, and specifically Israel's genocide over the last 16 months. Last October, Mélanie Joly, Canada's foreign minister, announced that Canada had in previous months suspended 30 permits to export military materiel to Israel. Even the CBC, Canada's official government broadcaster, suggested that this was a political stunt whose seriousness could not be evaluated without more transparency. What can you tell us about Canada's role in Israel's genocide, and have you seen any real shift in its stance since then?
Yeah, the first thing to note on the political side to this is that this was an announcement just before a by-election here in Montreal. where Palestine, I think maybe the first time in history, entered the actual debate, where it became a fairly significant issue. The NDP candidate actually, not as far as I would have liked, of course, but brought up Palestine, brought up genocide. And the Liberals, which this was a safe Liberal seat historically, as part of trying to counter the fact that they were doing very bad, they ultimately lost, that was an announcement to try to generate some like, oh yeah, we care about Palestinians kind of amidst a by-election. So that in of itself is kind of interesting. Now, of course, the substance of it is not substantive. I mean, we know a year ago, after huge campaigning on the issue, lots of disruptions of Trudeau in Vancouver, a very great disruption of him having dinner at a restaurant. They got inside and pushed the arms embargo and stuff to his face. The government agreed to no new arms permits. So there was, I think, a couple hundred, I forget the exact number, 200 and something that were in the pipeline already, that they didn't say they were stopping, but they weren't going to bring in any new arms permits for sales to Israel. What they did in the first few months of the genocide was they rapidly sped up the permitting process. They got it down to like 5 days to okay a permit for weapons sales to Israel. And of course, from a bureaucratic government, that's very, very fast. So I do believe that they are probably not accepting new permits. They've kind of been open enough, said that enough times, it's probably not, but we don't really know because there is a lack of transparency. But that's a little bit to the side anyways, because most of Canada's weapons sales to Israel are via the US, right? Canadian arms companies have, going back to the 1950s, have this special relationship where they sell to the Pentagon, to the US, as if they're basically US companies. And we don't know anything about this. So there's billions of dollars in weapons sales between Canadian companies and the US that we don't know any details. And when we find out the details, it's usually via the US announcing it, US government announcing it. So for instance, in the summer, there was an announcement of General Dynamics plant here in Montreal having a $61 million US mortars contract to Israel. And so the huge amount of arms from this plant here in Montreal that has nothing to do with the permitting that Mélanie Joly was referring to. And so and they've never said they were going to stop the flow of Canadian weapons to the Pentagon and to the US. And the Canadian companies provide all kinds of components to the F-35, for instance, which Israel's been using in bombing. So that question is, there's been some success, I think, on that front, but it's really minimal. Also, we should say that didn't stop the other side of the equation, which was Canada buying weapons from Israel. But then it also misses some of the maybe more substantively important side to Canada's ties to the Israeli military. So, for instance, I mentioned the Indigo. Well, Heather Reisman and Jerry Schwartz's billionaire couple, they have this fund, the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 Foundation, that over the past 20 years has sent $200 million in subsidized. So all Canadian taxpayers were subsidizing this as a registered charity to support non-Israelis joining the Israeli military. This violates Canada Revenue Agency rules about supporting foreign militaries, but they haven't stopped them from doing this. So Canada has all these different ties, things like the Sarel Foundation, where there's Canadians that go and work on Israeli military bases. Canada has all these ties, and that should contravene Canada's Foreign Enlistment Act. So all these ties to the Israeli military that actually violate Canadian law, be it Canada's through the Arms Trade Treaty, through the Foreign Enlistment Act, through the regulations around charities, that still assist the Israeli military, no matter what the Israeli military does to Palestinians, West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, wherever. So the government's definitely not serious about ending that. And you look at it, Mélanie Joly has made multiple what she called solidarity trips to Israel over the past 16 months.
And you mentioned, of course, the Canadian law, which makes it a crime for Canadian citizens to enlist in a foreign army. You've also mentioned in your postings that I've been reading Canada's Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act as other potential legislation that the Canadian government and Canadian officials and perhaps even Canadian private citizens are violating. And if Canada was a state governed by the rule of law, then one would expect that the Crown, as it's called, would be vigorously investigating these crimes and laying charges against them. But instead, they are coming after you for your social media posts, public social media posts, responding to a very prominent supporter of the genocide in Gaza. Yves, you are still facing these charges, which, as you said, you hope they would drop. I don't know if you will be taking other legal action in response to what has happened to you, but just before we go, how can people stay informed about what's happening with you, follow your work, and support you if they want to and if that support is needed?
Yeah, I mean, the simple thing is yvesengler.com, YVESENGLER.com, my website. I post my articles there. There is, donate page there if people are interested in that. But I think I'm on the different social media platforms people could seek out. We're going to be doing more stuff on this. There's more. Dalia Kurtz has now gone after a senator. Just broke yesterday. She's now targeting a senator, presumably with this lawyer, Neil Oberman. There's going to be more stuff going on, both on my case and kind of associated pushback against this lawfare, really. And so I definitely, people can check out groups like the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, Just Peace Advocates. We're going to be doing stuff on this. And yeah, on my, yvesengler.com, there'll be more posts, and I'm writing a number of stories that go into some more detail of what's transpired in recent days and how it fits into a bigger pattern of Canada suppressing Palestine solidarity. So, yeah.
Well, Yves, we are so grateful to you for the work that you do going back many years, including your articles for the Electronic Intifada, and perhaps there'll be more of those in the future. That would be something I know our readers would appreciate. And for, we're so sorry for all you endured in the last week or so. It's not an easy experience. And I'm just very glad to see that, as I expect, you have not been deterred in any way from speaking out. And I really think, Yves, what you said, I want to underline it. We are facing a wave of repression. It's very clear that that's happening, but we should not be intimidated or silenced. And you are right. They're doing this because there are so many of us, and they think that by picking a few of us off and making examples of us, they're going to either silence us or scare everyone else into silence. And we absolutely have to make sure that does not happen. Yeah. Thank you again,
much,
Yves.
Yeah.
And we hope to have you back soon.
That would be great. And again, people can go to yvesengler.com to read all of your writing, to learn more about your work, and to keep in touch and find ways to support you through this. Thanks so much, Yves. Well, that was great. He's, as long as I've been involved in the Palestine movement, I've known and loved and treasured Yves' work. So I'm so glad that we had him. And,
likewise. And it's just so, what do I want to say? It's so brazen what they're doing now. And it's almost pathetic
clumsy.
in a way. Pathetic. It really is. Yeah. If they think all this is going to work, it's not going to work.
No, it just strengthens everyone's determination to keep speaking out and make it louder. Well, thank you for that. And let's bring Jon on to talk about the last week in Gaza and the West Bank. Hey, Jon.
Hi, guys. Yeah, pathetic's a good word.
Yeah, it is. It is. Tell us, just give us a sense of your reaction to seeing the Palestinian prisoners coming home finally after 5 days, nearly a week of delay by the Israelis.
I mean, they're incredible pictures. I think they're unbelievable. And just to see, you know, the number of years that we've been following this, and it's historic. You know, it's only happened on this scale one other time in our lifetimes. And it's incredible. And it's also devastating to see the condition that they're coming out in, to see how normalized that is. I'm going to do in my report some of the things that the Israelis like made a big fuss about the ceremonies in Gaza. And you look at, it's just completely normalized how Palestinians come out. They can't even walk off the bus. They're being carried off the bus. They're being put directly into an ambulance and taken straight to the hospital from these prisons. And people from Gaza who aren't even charged. There's not even a pretense that they're charged. They were just taken from shelters, from hospitals, from schools, and tortured, and coming back with broken limbs. And for some reason, I mean, I guess it's the same reason always, that's not covered.
No.
But it's been amazing these last 7 weeks, sort of every Saturday. I mean, they delayed this one till today, so we saw it happening as we were getting ready for the show. But it's incredible.
Yeah.
Stay free. And it's an important part of a liberation movement to get your people out of prison. So this is a core tenet of the Palestinian struggle, and it's been amazing to watch it happen. And there'll be more.
Yeah. Well, as Ali likes to say, take it away, Jon.
All right. So this is the resistance report for day 510 since the October 7th operation, ceasefire day 40. I am reporting on the prisoner exchanges that happened on Saturday, February the 22nd, and today is the 27th of February. And as of today, there's now been 9 handovers of Israeli captives, 7 sets of living captives totaling 25, and 2 sets of coffins of deceased Israelis totaling 33, and now 1,800 Palestinians have been released, and Israel's still holding up 200 more that were supposed to be released in total. So this is the end of phase 1 of the ceasefire. This is the last exchanges of the ceasefire, and that's what I'll be covering now. So let's take a look at the Gaza map. It's a good way to get our bearings. So there's been release ceremonies that have taken place from the northern most Gaza Strip, so the northern Jabalia refugee camp, just south of Beit Lahia, near Kamal Adwan Hospital. That's just south of Beit Lahia, right at the top of the map there. There's been 3 or 4 in Gaza City itself, 1 in the Gaza port. In the middle camps, Deir al-Balah had a release. Khan Yunis has had several. And I'm going to report right now on Rafah. And if we look at the next map, we get the zoom in on Rafah. And just to note that the Israelis have been violating this ceasefire throughout. Only 70% of the 600 aid trucks that were supposed to come in a day have reached Gaza. Only 10% of the 200,000 tents, which is in a very... It's winter. It's winter. There was storms all week this week, and those tents are not coming in. There's supposed to be 200,000 of them. Only 10% have passed through, and no trailers that were supposed to go to civilians, 60,000. None of those have passed. Less than 15% of the 50 patients that are supposed to pass each day for medical care have been released through the Rafah crossing, which you can see down at the bottom of that map. That's where the exiting of the patients is happening. And there's been more than 350 Israeli security violations throughout this stage of the ceasefire. So the map that we're looking at there, you can see Tel El Sultan. That is where Yahya Sinwar was killed. in October. The Philadelphia corridor runs along the border with Egypt that you see there to the left of the map. Israel announced today that they are not going to leave the Philadelphia corridor, which is a further violation of the ceasefire. I don't, these are kind of, these statements leading into stage 2. I'm not sure how valuable they are, because the stage 2 negotiations will include Israel leaving the Philadelphia corridor. So some of these statements are made for a domestic audience that that the Israeli government wants to seem tough to. So this exchange that I'm going to start with is the Rafah Brigade. This was their first opportunity for an exchange. As I said, they've happened all over Gaza. This is Rafah's first. It happened in eastern Rafah. And if we take a look at video number 1 here, we can see the video report that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 released. So we're watching the shadow unit here, the guards for the prisoners. Shadow unit was set up in 2006 after the capture of 𝐄𝐥𝐿 𝐄𝐿, who was captured by the Rafah Brigade at Kerem Shalom. Again, you see a secured site, organized, no crowds. You see weapons, captured weapons on the stage there. I'll break down each of these components in still frames after we watch this video. Again, I'm leaving out the captives, not showing those because it's a violation of the Third Geneva Convention, and also because YouTube takes them down, although we know that the standards are different for Palestinians than they are for Israelis. So there you see shadow unit. That's the logo of the shadow unit of the trucks arriving. Those are the shadow unit guards meeting up with the Rafah Brigade here. And this is the same formalities that we've seen in all these exchanges. They go up, they meet with the Red Cross, they sign over an official papers. Here's the shadow unit meeting with the Rafah Brigade. And they hand over the prisoners. The prisoners were spoke from the stage briefly, but they're not coerced. They're not held in any way. They're not in handcuffs. They're not. They haven't been abused in any way, unlike Israeli prison service does to the Palestinians. There's a lot of detail on this stage. This was the Rafah Brigade's first opportunity to communicate through these exchanges. You can see the paperwork being signed off here, something we've seen at every exchange. And this is the release of the captives that we've edited out. You can see in the destroyed buildings, we have people watching. People are fascinated by this process. Of course, it's been 500 days of their lives totally absorbed in this entire situation. So there's a certain fascination with the release of these captives. If we go to number 2 here, we can look at the stage in detail. On the left there, you see Mohammed al-Deif, the commander of the Qassam Brigades, who was assassinated in July. Below him there, you see Riyad al-Attar. He is the Rafah Brigade commander that was assassinated in 2014. He led the 𝐄𝐿 𝐄𝐿 operation, which was a tunnel operation at Kerem Shalom in Rafah on the border with Israel. I mean, it's not a border, it's a fence in a ghetto. But that operation tunneled underneath the wall and came up and captured the Israeli soldier, the Israeli tank gunner 𝐄𝐿 𝐄𝐿, and brought him back into Gaza. So Riyad al-Attar there is on the left. On the right is Mohammed Abu Shmala. He was the Eastern battalion commander in the Rafah Brigades. He was also assassinated along with Riyad al-Attar in 2014 while they were negotiating the ceasefire during the 2014 war. And underneath, you can see Mahmoud Hamdan, he is the Tell Sultan battalion commander who was killed with Yahya Sinwar, and a couple lesser known commanders, Abdullah al-Hur, he is the a chief of the Rafah Reserve Brigade, and Sobi Abu Shara, who is the leader of the Weapons and Services Unit of the Rafah Battalion, of the Rafah Brigade. So you can see we've seen this at each of these, the martyrs, local martyrs, shown on the stage. If you look along the bottom skirt there, we have the quote from 𝐄𝐥𝐿 𝐄𝐿 that he gave that I've interpreted from the poem of 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐿 poem, that in front of true freedom is a closed door, pushed a little more open by every hand bloodied in the struggle. And then you can see on that skirt of the stage, there's operations. There's 7 operations that you can see along there. I'm going to show you each of those 7 operations. But on the upper right of the stage, you can see Mohammed al-Deif, and he's saying that we can change the course of history. And that quote comes from the Al Jazeera documentary that had Mohammed al-Deif speaking before the October 7th operation, commanding the operation. And that's one of the things he said about October 7th while planning the operation. So they've memorialized that on the right-hand side of the stage, facing the stage. And then on the back splash of the stage, you can see operations. The one on the left is of is from October 7th. The soldier that you see won over, he was captured in 2014 during the 2014 war in Rafah. We see the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 anti-tank guided missile system, which was Rafah. Rafah used that system. We'll show you that coming up, but they memorialized that. And an exploding tank. In the air, you see hang gliders that were synonymous with October 7th operation. And then you see the ubiquitous helicopter medevac, the medevac helicopters that were a key part of Qassam's videos throughout the war, showing the medical evacuation of soldiers targeted in these operations. So it was an interesting thing because you see on the skirt there on the bottom, you see those 7 operations. And throughout this war, I've been showing you almost all of their operations and picking out the notable ones, but this is the first time that we've heard from the brigade themselves which ones they thought were notable. And so you can see those along the bottom. I put those all together here for you in a little Rafah brigade mixtape. If we want to go to number 3, you can see these operations that they had on the wall. So this is a tunnel operation with a Shawad explosively formed penetrator. You're going to watch this soldier. I showed you this operation. I showed you all these operations during the war, but you see he places it at the optimal distance to the back door of the Merkava tank, where the weakest point other than the turret gap is, and he dives back down into the tunnel and he's underground. Here is the one where the 2 fighters used guerrilla action devices and ran up and hand placed them underneath the tank turret there, and you watch that is the weakest spot on the tank, and they put 2 of them in there, destroying that tank. That first operation, the tunnel operation, was the 21st of May. It was like just less than 2 weeks into the actual battle, and the first week of the battle in Rafah. Here we see a Namr troop carrier, and you're going to watch this one. The troop carrier has 2 soldiers riding outside the hatch. The commanders are riding outside the hatch, and you see they stop because they see an ambush set up, and they reverse, and they're trying to reverse out of the ambush when they're hit with a Yasin, while both of those soldiers were outside of the tank. So that was obviously a well-planned ambush, since they have the cameraman in the exact position to cover that operation. That's the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 that I talked about, and hitting a Namr troop carrier there, and now it's burning. This is the only time we saw this weapon used in Gaza, was used by the Rafah Brigade. And this is Hossam, the sniper from the Operation Avenging Sinwar series of operations. Edited out his sniper hits because YouTube doesn't allow those. But here comes another operation with a guerrilla action device hand delivered to this Namr troop carrier. So Rafah Brigade, they did a lot of hand-delivered operations. There's a number more of operations that they could have chosen from. It's interesting to see that these are the 7 that they think are the ones that they wanted to represent them on the stage, which is something notable because we don't hear from them directly. We just hear from them through their through the videos. And this is the one where they destroyed this Namr troop carrier, and there's no audio on this one, but the fighter is so excited about hitting this, and he yells out, "They are the killers of women and children," as that number blows up. A lot of times you see Israel's people saying that the tanks, that the Yassins don't do anything. You can see from this one that is absolutely not true. And so that was a notable operation and a success. And you can see it there burning afterwards, still burning. The cameraman's able to get right in there and see that shot. So those are the best of from the skirt of the stage that the Rafah Brigade wanted us to see. If we look at number 4, we got more captured weapons. And this is interesting because, so these are Israel Weapon Industries Tavor X95 bullpup rifles that we've been seeing fighters carrying that were captured. A lot of them were captured on October 7th, but this is the first time that one of the brigades has said that these weapons were captured in Gaza during battles. So the Rafah Brigade made that point, that these were pointedly captured during battles in Rafah. And you can see the M16 and M4 variants that Israel uses. So these are, and you can clearly see their battle-worn rifles, so captured in the course of battle. And this still photo is of the soldiers setting up the weapons on the stage here, but he's going to go back and hang dog tags from the soldiers that they captured the weapons from. So pretty remarkable series of the Rafah Brigade really did it up in this one. If we look at number 5, they also brought out their archers. They brought out the Yassin teams. You see about a dozen of them there. You can see some that are brand new, some that are battle worn. You can see the thermobaric warhead on the far right of your screen there, the beige one. And this is the most any brigade has brought out of their archer team. So the Rafah Brigade did that in force. Number 6 is the same thing, just a different angle of them. You can see them all here. There's even more here. This is about 2 dozen of them. You can see the first one closest to you is in pristine shape. And as you work down, you can see the battle-used ones. The beige ones are the thermobaric warheads. And those I've described to you many times during operations, but you get a good shot of them there, a good look of them there. And as I've told you, over these 15 months. The thermobaric is unique to Gaza. The tandem charged thermobaric is unique to Gaza. They built the thermobaric inside the casing of the tandem Soviet PG-7VR. So that's unique to Gaza. I just like to point that out for people. And one more silhouette of them here, because we always saw them firing. We often saw it from the perspective of the launcher, so that was a good opportunity to see the Yassin in its form. And of course, the Yassin was the linchpin of the defense of Gaza. So the fact that they had these out in the ceremony, I think, was really significant. So that was the Rafah Brigade. On the same day, about an hour and a half later, the Central Brigade was able to carry out their first. That they had one previous release in Dar al-Balah, so this is their second release. But this was in the Nusrat camp that you see there, just south of the Netzarim corridor. So the Nusrat battalion, they were fighting the building of the corridor, as well as the Maghazi battalion. They were fighting the creation of the corridor along with the Barej battalion. So the Central Brigade is the Nusrat battalion, the Barej battalion, Maghazi battalion, and Dar al-Balah battalion. And of course, the Central Camps has many key leaders from the Qassam brigades, both living in this generation and from previous. Adnan al-Ghul, who the sniper rifle is named after and is the father of the Qassam weapons industry. He's from al-Maghazi camp. And Ayman Nofel was the Central Brigade commander. He was assassinated earlier in the war. And Marwan Issa, he was killed in March. He was assassinated in March, and he was the number 2 and really the operational chief of the Qassam brigades, the number 2 to Mohammed al-Daif. And his role, Marwan Issa's role from the Central Brigades, informing the professionalization of the 𝐶𝐶𝑚 brigades is going to be something that history will reflect well on him for professionalizing and creating. Adnan al-Ghul's goal was to get weapons in the hands of the fighters and have that to proliferate. And Marwan Issa and Ahmed Jabari were part of were at the driving force to professionalize and create an army, a national army out of the 𝐶𝐶𝑚 brigade. So all of that in the central camp's history. So let's look at number 10. Sorry, this is their video that they released of the exchange. And here you see a real nationalistic event. You can see fighters from all factions are taking part in this event. You have marching here in formation. You'll note the headbands. They're all wearing the same uniform. They're wearing a national uniform. But each faction of the Joint Operations Room is present there in the in this handover, which was other factions have been present in other events, but this was the most formalized one, and it was a real statement to the Joint Operations Room that we've been covering throughout the war. And you see here they put up the Palestinian flag, so real national army vibes coming out of this, and that's them all across the stage there. I'll break down who was all there when we go to the still pictures, but again, a well-organized event. These are not the way that the Israelis describe them. So, and Marwan Issa's son was there, and Marwan Issa's son was carrying a sign that says, "This land grows resistance fighters just as it grows olive trees," which was a statement from Abu Ubaidah earlier in the war. So, yeah, this is them marching in formation. Of course, you have the 𝐶𝐶𝑚 brigades are the head of the Joint Operations Room. Saraya al-Quds, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Abu Ali Mustafa brigades, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine's National Resistance brigades. The Popular Resistance Committees were there in that line. They have the Nasser Salahdin brigades, and there's multiple battalions of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs brigades. The Mujahideen brigades and the Ansar brigades are all in there marching in formation, really underscoring the Joint Operations Room. We can look at the next slide too, that just shows more of that. You can see them all on the stage there, the 10 different factions that we've been reporting on throughout the war. And underneath the stage on the skirt there, in Hebrew, as a message just to the Israelis, that's Netanyahu's quote that he said, "Military pressure is the only way to return the captives." So they're highlighting that is incorrect, because the captives were not returned through violence on that stage. And one more of the joint operations in the close-up there, you can see them, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs brigades, Al-Amudi battalion. You can see the DFLP there, Saraya, Mujahideen brigades, Al-Aqsa Martyrs brigades, and 𝐶𝐶𝑚 in that, and the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades are there too in the second from the right. So joint operations, interesting statement made by the Nusrat release. Number 15 shows the successes of the military operations. This is that sign says, "The hell of Maghazi made by our hands, and blessed was our aim." Maghazi battalion carried out the operation that killed 21 Israeli soldiers, the largest toll that Israel admitted to of the war. And the operation was a multi-stage operation where a Yasin archer fired on an Israeli position that was full of anti-tank mines that Israel was using to demolish houses along the Netzarim corridor in order to build the Netzarim corridor. And the 𝐶𝐶𝑚 Brigade's Maghazi battalion got a series of IEDs, a minefield into the area where these soldiers were staying in a house that was stacked with anti-tank mines, and they triggered the explosion of the building. We can look at that operation next. I queued that up with number 16. So it's the same archer. It's you guys probably remember me breaking down this operation. He fires on the house, then he comes around, reloads with another another Yasin here, and fires on the mark of a tank. He dives back down into the tunnel, and down in the tunnel, the guys hear the building explode. And that was something that the Israelis had to admit to, because it was a massive cloud of smoke, and it was one of those difficult security situations that Israel talked about when things went wrong. So, so that's the Central Brigade pointing to their most successful operations, and that's the operation that you saw right there. And then number 17, there was this sentiment was in many of the last exchanges. The sticker on says, "We'll force you to forget about your plans, like forget about your objectives. We forced you to make your military objectives fail, and we don't forgive either." And this is a reference to the Israelis who dressed up the prisoners who were being released in threatening shirts that said, "We will not forgive, we will not forget," with Star of David's on them. They handcuffed the prisoners and made them put their heads down with their handcuffs behind their back and the Star of David on their back that said, "We will not forgive, we will not forget." And they gave them wristbands that had further threats about how they would hunt them down after they were released. And so this guy's got a sticker on his Yasin referring to that. But also the Israel Prison Service found slogans carved on the walls of Palestinian prisoners' cells before their release, because this started 2 weeks ago, Israel giving these threatening shirts. And in the cells, the Palestinian prisoners about to be released said, "We will not forget, we will not forgive, and we will not kneel." Slogans written by prisoners inside Israeli prisons. So again, communication inside and outside the prisons, communications to Gaza, communications to the Palestinians writ large, and communication to the Israelis. So this is what we've seen all along in these ceremonies that you might have heard in the Western media were called grotesque. They really aren't. They're pointed messaging events that are there's a lot to break down in these. So that was the Central Brigade's opportunity. And then I just want to show you the 𝐄𝐿 𝐄𝐿 one. This was on a Thursday, 1 week ago today. And this was the handover of the Bibas family and one other captive who was killed by Israeli bombs. And this ceremony was called grotesque in the Western media as well. And what we're seeing is the fighters carrying coffins and putting them up on a stand to be passed dignified into a Red Crescent vehicle. You can see the fighters walking in formation here, carrying. It's far from grotesque. It's actually a very dignified way of handling this situation where this family was blown to pieces by American and Israeli bombs. And the juxtaposition between this funeral ceremony for these Israelis compared to the ceremonies that Palestinians experience, where they're buried in alleyways or the median of a road, or all the kind of shocking non-burials that happen in Gaza. I just wanted to point this out. We can look at the next slide too, because you really can see it in the next slide. They had a black curtain covering over the coffins. So the stage had a black curtain, and then they revealed the coffins behind the curtain. So they weren't even displaying the coffins. So this seemed very dignified to me and didn't match. I mean, the Israelis expect that you're not going to know what they're talking about these ceremonies. But this ceremony here was the reason why Israel postponed releasing the prisoners. They really bucked at this one, and at the one in Nusrat, where the shadow unit brought 2 prisoners who were not being released, who were with their friends, soldiers. The Nusrat release was 3 soldiers, and they brought 2 other soldiers along. And didn't release them, and had them on camera telling Netanyahu, like, don't forget about us, move on to stage 2. But when Netanyahu talks about the humiliation of these ceremonies, he's not talking about the prisoners. He's talking about all these messages that I'm breaking down for you here that are highlighting all of Israel's military failures and failures of the objectives of their operations. So And then there's just one more here that I wanted to show you, because this is about the Bibas family. It's about the civilian family. And so the messaging on this one was very clear. 11,000 injured, it says. This is that sign says Zionism in numbers. 111,000 injured, 9,268 massacres, and then these focus on families because the Bibas were a family. 4,889 families with only one family member left. 2,092 family names completely wiped off the civil registry. 17,881 kids killed. 12,316 women. 38,000 kids lost one parent. 17,000 kids in Gaza lost both their parents. So again, they use this messaging for a little bit of perspective on the situation with the Bibases. And the final point I want to make is the National Campaign to Recover the Bodies of Martyrs released a statement that says the occupation continue. The Israelis continue to detain 665 bodies of martyrs in the numbered cemeteries and refrigerators, some of them since the 1960s and 70s. The last of them was a martyr from Al-Farah camp yesterday. And so these bodies are not returned. They're held by Israel along with the more than 1,500 martyrs, the 1,500 prisoners that were released in this exchange. So while Israel's complaining about the way that these dignified coffins were passed over to the Red Cross, Israel is still holding 665 Palestinian bodies. So that is prisoner exchange 7. It's the final one of phase 1. 1,781 Palestinians have been released, 275 life sentences, 295 long sentences, 70 women and children. And the rest are from Gaza, 1,000 from Gaza plus 200 women and children that should be released in the coming days. There are now, according to Israel, there's 59 now remaining. And so there's somewhere between 24 and 30 of them thought to be alive in Gaza. And that is what the stage 2 negotiations will be about. So that is the resistance report for this week. We will continue to follow the ceasefire going forward. But that's the report for this week.
Thank you so much, Jon. I was reading some statements by the Gaza government media office this past week, and this didn't make it into the news report, but they had a meeting with the International Committee of the Red Cross, a delegation with the ICRC, to talk about the double standards that have been applied to the transfer of dead bodies, where Israel gets to complain and say, as you said, it was a undignified way of transporting, the bodies in the black coffins with a very dignified ceremony. Netanyahu called it a national embarrassment. The ICRC really criticized the Palestinian resistance for it. So the government media office sat down with the ICRC and said, you didn't say anything when Israel literally dumped unidentified rotting corpses in the back of a truck a couple months ago. There was no international outcry. There was no recrimination or accountability.
Digging up bodies in cemeteries throughout the war. It was all like their side project was to dig up more than a dozen cemeteries. Yeah, that scene where they dumped hundreds of bodies in blue plastic bags. They dumped them out of a dump truck.
Yeah,
it's disgusting to even talk about.
I know.
And not to mention the horrific scenes we've seen time and again of filmed in many cases by Israeli soldiers of Palestinian bodies being crushed, being abused, being eaten by animals.
Right.
I mean, things that don't even bear description, let alone having to watch them. And this is all so normalized. We didn't hear any complaints from all the quarters that were telling us how horrific it was to see the bodies of that Israeli family, as Jon says, and we'll have more to say about this during the discussion. But as Jon points out, they were returned in as dignified a way as can be in such an overall horrific situation, and certainly as compared with how Palestinians living and dead are being treated.
Yes. Yeah. So I hope the ICRC got the message from the Gaza government media office. I don't expect that it will that Israel will be told that it can't desecrate Palestinian bodies, because that's part and parcel of Israel's state project. But we'll see. And I'm glad that the media office was able to communicate these double standards and these hypocrisies by bodies like the ICRC. So, well, we have a lot more to discuss. We are going to get back into stage 2 of the ceasefire deal, a lot more coming up. But first, Asa, you have a short segment on also double standards and censorship, and the way that Israeli children are deemed more valuable than Palestinians. This week, sorry, this is a tangent, but yesterday the Empire State Building in New York City was lit up with orange lights to honor the Israeli children, the Bibas children. But there has been no lights lit up for any of the tens of thousands of Palestinian children. Again, it's, as Jon said, it's just normalized. So anyway, there was a BBC documentary that was up very briefly over the last week about Gaza's children, about the tens of thousands of children who have either been killed or have survived the Holocaust. Tell us about that and what you've uncovered.
Yes, that's right, Nora. So last week the BBC removed its film called Gaza: How to Survive a War Zone from its streaming service iPlayer, and it was broadcast on BBC Two, one of the broadcast channels in the UK, but it was removed from the streaming service. Now, this takedown came after an intense campaign by anti-Palestinian activists in Britain, who have close ties to the Israeli state. Now, as justification for their deletion of the film, the BBC claimed that it had been made aware only after broadcast that its narrator, who you can see on screen here, a 13-year-old Palestinian boy, Abdullah Yazuri, that he was the son of a former agricultural minister of the Palestinian government in Gaza. Now, I watched the film earlier today. It's about just under an hour long, and it is a powerful piece of work. And it's told from the point of view of several children, mostly from the point of view of children in Gaza during the post-October 7th genocide in the Gaza Strip that we've been covering all this time. And it concludes around about the time of last month's ceasefire. Let's watch a short clip. There were so many segments I could have chosen, but we've just got a short clip to give you a sense of what that is like.
Order. You have to leave fast, or it can be deadly.
ايش بصير؟ زي ما انت شايف يا اخي. ايش بصير؟ فجأة في دقائق يلا امشوا، في دقائق حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل في العرب. ايش اللي بصير؟ خشوا علينا اليهود. خشوا علينا.
Thank you, Tamara. So for listeners, I mean, you can still, just with the audio, get a sense of that. But essentially what the clip showed was men, women and children fleeing and crying as Israeli gunfire is heard in the background. And the narrator explained that, you know, what we've seen during the genocide, which was Palestinians repeatedly displaced from their homes, from their tents, displaced over and over again, and told that a certain area is a closed military zone or that it's a danger zone and that they must evacuate. And this is very graphically shown in that clip and throughout the film. It's a powerful and disturbing scene. Now, in an open letter to the BBC, 700 TV, film and media workers, you know, some stars of stage and screen, as it were, as well as producers and so forth, they wrote an open letter, and they called the deletion an act of, quote, politically motivated censorship. The signatories included sports broadcaster and former footballer Gary Lineker and Harry Potter star Miriam Margolyes, as well as many others. In a clarification posted on its website, the BBC stated that there had been, quote, continuing questions raised about the programme, and in the light of these, we are conducting further due diligence with the production company. The programme will not be available on iPlayer while this is taking place, end of quote. The BBC's crackdown came after a blog post by David Collier, who is a notorious anti-Palestinian blogger with ties to Israel's former Ministry of Strategic Affairs. Collier's nonsensical claim that the documentary's narrator is part of what he called, quote, Hamas royalty was laundered by the London Times, as you can see here in this article. Despite Collier's obsessive focus on the boys' families' involvement in the civilian government of Gaza, Collier's blog post actually doesn't dispute any facts in the film. What the film does show in stark detail is Israel's systematic campaign of violence against the civilian population in Gaza. Collier's claim that the film is the product of, quote, a well-oiled Hamas propaganda machine is a total lie. I mean, if you watch the entire film, Abdullah, the child narrator, repeatedly reads out official Israeli army justifications. Every time there's an act of Israeli violence shown on screen, he reads out the spokesperson's official responses as per the usual BBC approach of quote-unquote balance. And then there is another Palestinian boy, the 11-year-old Zachariah, who's a young volunteer at the Al-Aqsa hospital, who really is, in my view, is really the main protagonist of the film. He spends most time on screen. It's quite, you've really taken on a journey with him and shown how he's kind of had to grow up before his time. It's very sad and tragic. But there is, towards the end of the film, when Zachariah is asked by the filmmaker if he likes Hamas, the boy says, I don't like them, and even states that they started the war. So in the BBC's selection of its interview subjects for the film, they tried their usual approach, which is a highly flawed approach in my view, of trying to impose a balance on a unbalanced reality. And this still wasn't enough for Israel and its lobby in the UK, who immediately set about crying anti-Semitism and demanding that the BBC withdraw the film. The so-called campaign against anti-Semitism, which also has close ties to Israel, held an anti-Palestinian rally outside the BBC against the film, in exactly the same spot, incidentally, where the Palestine solidarity protesters have recently been banned by the Labour government from protesting. So people who want to criticise the BBC's coverage for being biased towards Israel, for not giving enough critical coverage of Israel, were actively banned from protesting outside the BBC, whereas these pro-genocide, anti-Palestinian protesters were allowed to from the campaign against anti-Semitism, there it is, were allowed to protest outside. And you can see they've got these kind of images of a Palestinian fighter in a mosque with the BBC on their headband. So it's worth stating that David Collier, the blogger who is behind this laundering of Israeli propaganda into the Times article that we showed earlier, one of the main forces of this campaign against the BBC for this film, is known for his extreme anti-Palestinian racism, and he's defamed Palestinian refugees as a weapon, in his words, and he's also described the Palestinian desire for freedom, the Palestinian cause, as, quote, a disease. So just openly racist terms. I mean, you can see him here in this article, speaking in a panel alongside Melanie Phillips, who's quite an openly anti-Muslim columnist in the UK. You can read years of our reporting about David Collier over on our website, electronicintifada.net. If you search for his name there, we've done quite a lot of detailed reporting on that. Now, finally, it's worth saying as well that if you want to watch the censored film, I guess we're going to have to wait and see what happens with it, if it gets reinstated on the streaming platform or not. I suppose it depends on the amount of pressure that can be brought to bear on the BBC. But for now, you'll have to use an unlicensed copy, which some have been made online, some have been deleted. But this one here was posted to X by 𝐄𝐥𝐿𝐈𝐧𝐭𝐫𝐿. Apologies for mispronouncing this Turkish name. But this user account has posted a full copy of the film, which you can watch it there. So I think we probably want to discuss it a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks for that. And some of the, manufactured controversy around it too has been also criticism, and that's to put it mildly, of Palestinians in the film who describe Israelis as Yahud, which is kind of the regular vernacular describing Israelis. It's also, of course, translated to Jews, and people have been very upset that that Palestinians are correctly identifying their occupier and their the people who are bombing them as such. What can we say about this very manufactured controversy?
I think there's two issues. Like, we work with professional translators at the Electronic Intifada, especially when several of our colleagues, of course, speak and write Arabic, and some of them, like Ali and Tamara, and are native speakers. And we also, when we work on translations from the Hebrew media, we work with the several professional translators. And one of the constant debates that we have when we're having things translated to us is the issue of literalism in translation versus translating the sense of what makes most sense in the context for the audience. And these are not always easy questions. And, yes, it's true, of course, the word Yahud in Arabic is the word for Jews. But in this context, it's very clear they're talking about Israeli soldiers who are shooting at them when they're saying Yahud. So it's not inaccurate to describe them as Israelis in the subtitle, in my view. Nonetheless, there's a wider point, really, that Ali made very well on X about the nature of Israel and how they describe themselves.
Yeah.
Context is important. It's very common for Palestinians in Palestine, in the West Bank, in Gaza, perhaps Palestinians in Israel, to refer to Israeli Jews as just Jews. El-Yahud iju. The Jews came to the village. El-Yahud dammaru. The Jews destroyed a house or whatever it is. In that context, why do they do that? I mean, there's a couple of reasons. One is because it is Israel who identifies itself to the Palestinians as the Jews. That's the Israelis say, and it's now part of their constitutional law, it always has been, that Israel is the state of the Jews, and the Jews are the only people who have sovereignty between the river and the sea. And they use Jewish symbolism, the Star of David, the menorah, for their state. They put the Jewish symbols on their weapons, on their tanks, on their warplanes, on their uniforms. And the system of rule that Israel has imposed is one of what B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, accurately describes as Jewish supremacy. The reason Jewish settlers are allowed to steal Palestinian land and cut down olive trees and build settlements in their place is solely because they're Jews, solely because they're Jews. And the reason that Palestinians have no rights whatsoever, no matter how many generations back they can trace their families in Palestine, whether it's the right of refugees to return or the right of Palestinians simply to exist on their land, is solely because they're not Jews. Solely because they're not Jews. Palestinians expelled in 1948 are not allowed back by Israel solely and exclusively for not being Jews. So the only relevant identifier is that the Israeli soldiers are coming as representatives of this self-identified Jewish state. So there's nothing extraordinary about this. We wouldn't consider it strange if Jewish people during World War II referred to the Nazis as the Germans. It doesn't mean every German was a Nazi or supported the Nazis, but in the context of the war, it made sense because that's how the state identified itself. And it also predates the existence of Israel, because when the Zionist settlers came to Palestine starting in the late 1800s, they came not as Israelis. There was no such thing as Israel. They came as Jews, and they said, we're coming here because we're Jews. Of course, I don't make the mistake, and this is very important to underline, I don't make the mistake of equating Jews and Judaism on the one hand with Zionism and Israel on the other. That's an equation Israel wants us to make, and it's one that Palestinians generally don't make in the broader context. They don't equate the Israeli soldiers who are coming to murder them and expel them from their homes with Jews generally all over the world. So we're talking about something that is in the specific context of Palestinians in Palestine, referring to their oppressors in the language that the oppressors describe themselves, that Benjamin Netanyahu uses, that Itamar Ben-Gvir uses. These are their descriptors. They say we're coming as Jews. When Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, flew to Israel after October 7th to support the genocide and to give Israel flashing green lights to mass murder Palestinians, he said, I come here as a Jew. I come here as a Jew. That's what Antony Blinken, Joe Biden's Secretary of State, said. So he wanted to make clear that his support for the genocide which was about to unfold was not just as an American official, but as a Jew. So it's important to point out that it is Zionists and Israel and their supporters who are falsely equating Jews and Jewish people with these horrific crimes that Israel is perpetrating. And I'll also say that Hamas, as a part of the Palestinian resistance, has made clear repeatedly from its top leadership down, and this is part of their sort of renewed official charter that was published in 2017. They say that we fight the Israelis not because they're Jews, but because they're our oppressors. And in this exactly the same way that the Algerians fought the French, not because they didn't like camembert and brie and I don't know, what is it, baguettes and garlic and berets. It wasn't because they're anti-French or because they don't like complicated subjunctive tenses of the French language. It's because the French were their oppressors. The French had come to steal their country from them and subjugate them. That's why Algerians fought the French. When Kenyans rose up against the British, it wasn't because they didn't like tea and crumpets and gin and tonic in the afternoon on a plantation. Well, they probably didn't like that because those British plantations were land stolen from Kenyans. It was because the British came there to steal their country, to steal their labor, to effectively enslave them. And so when Palestinians fight Israel, the self-described Jewish state, it's because they're colonizers. And I just think we have to, so this fake outrage that they created, that the word Yehud was correctly translated in the context as Israeli, is just another attempt to blame victims and demonize them, when in fact, and this gets no comment from the British mainstream media or from the BBC or from all these people fakely outraged over this, that the term Muslim is used in an almost purely derogatory way, the way we saw recently Elon Musk and other right-wing international figures inciting against Muslims in the UK, the way Hamas is equated with ISIS, Western-backed ISIS, in order to demonize them and to equate them with savagery. All of this Islamophobia, all of this hatred of Muslims is so normalized. I mean, 1,000 times a day on Twitter, I'm told, you Muslims support this, you Muslims support that, you Muslims, your prophet is this, your prophet is, I'm not going to repeat the filthy, disgusting abuse they use, that you never see, or with perhaps very, very, very rarely, that you never see from Palestinians. Palestinians don't denigrate Judaism as a religion. These are very rare things if they happen from misguided people. But in terms of the vast mass of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian leadership, it never happens. To the extent that we've seen Israeli captives who are released from Gaza saying how when they were trying to survive the bombing in Gaza, the Israeli bombing, the guards tried to get them items that they could use to celebrate the Jewish holidays in captivity in Gaza. That's the extent they went to. We heard there was one thing in the Times of Israel the other day where a former Israeli captive, this was presented as saying, oh, look how cruel Hamas is, that when it was Hanukkah, which is the annual Jewish holiday that usually falls around the end of December and is celebrated by lighting candles every night, the Israeli captive said, we need candles to celebrate Hanukkah, and the guards were only able to find, these glue sticks that look like candles that were not candles. And the Israeli captive said, those aren't candles. And then the Palestinian guards went and found them like an electric candle so they could celebrate Hanukkah in captivity. And this was presented in the Times of Israel as an example of the cruelty of the Hamas guards who are making it so hard for these Jewish captives to celebrate their religion, when in fact they were trying to help them. And there were other examples of that. So I just want to say,
how many mosques have been
hundreds of mosques destroyed, including
Gaza.
the Omari Mosque in Gaza, the most ancient, one of the most ancient mosques in the world, not just in Palestine, that goes back, I visited in 2013. When I visited it, it had just been restored to its glory as this beautiful ancient building, and it lies in ruins, and we don't see any outrage of that, and deliberately dynamiting mosques and filming it. That's what Israeli soldiers were doing, and dedicating the destruction of mosques and the desecration of Qur'ans as to their friends, just as a joke. We saw them entering mosques and desecrating them, and then attaching those limpet mines to them that they used to demolish them. All of this religious, genocidal religious hatred of Muslims and Palestinian Christians, of course, it has to be said. When we go back to the talk of the way bodies were treated, what about the way Israeli soldiers attacked the funeral of Shireen Abu Akleh, almost bringing her casket down in what have been absolutely even more horrific than it was? What about the way Israel has spared no one in Gaza, including the Christian community, from this genocide? And people have the chutzpah to complain that Palestinians use a word to identify their oppressors that is exactly the same word the oppressors use to identify themselves.
It's a point that our friend
exhausting. Yeah.
Joseph Massad often makes, that this pretext and this sort of pretense that you often get from Zionists in the West, from pro-Israel propagandists, and from the state of Israel itself, that Palestinians are only fighting against the Israelis because they're Jews, presupposes that had they been any other religious or ethnic identity, they would have said, welcome, come in, take our land. It would have been completely fine if they were Buddhists or Christians or Hindus or whatever else other ethnicity or religion.
Jews
it's a complete
always
nonsense.
lived among Palestinians, and as others did, and that to prove, Asa, to underline your point, there were always Jews in Palestine prior to the European Zionist invasion. There were always Jews in Palestine, Palestinian Jews who lived there, and Palestine was always a country whose people welcomed others. That's why you have a strong Armenian community in Palestine. That's why there's an Afro-Palestinian community in Jerusalem. That's why there are people from the Caucasus and Chechnya and Bosnia whose roots go back generations in Palestine, because the Palestinian people, the indigenous people of Palestine, were always welcoming and open to people, including Jews who came from Europe prior to the Zionist movement, but who came on religious pilgrimages or to study. They didn't come as colonizers. They didn't come to take over the country and establish a so-called Jewish state. So just this lie is another projection by Zionists in Israel to demonize Palestinians and justify their murder. But what it is projection. It's a reflection of the racial and ethnic and religious hatred that the Zionist colonizers bear towards the indigenous people of Palestine, that as we speak right now, they are still trying to destroy, if not through bombing, because of the so-called ceasefire, through continued attempts to starve them to death and to freeze them to death, which is what's happening now because of the continued refusal of Israel to allow in adequate humanitarian supplies, as is required by the deal that Israel signed.
Right. I mean, I'm just reminded of the children's art that had been, and this is something that I covered for the Electronic Intifada back in, I don't know what, 2010, 2011, where right after Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 2009, children in Gaza who were working with organizations like the Middle East Children's Alliance and 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐿 in Gaza made artwork to process their trauma of living through 3 weeks, which was a long time at the time. I mean, compared with 16 months, 3 weeks of relentless assaults that killed hundreds and hundreds of children, destroyed homes and infrastructure. And these children were drawing art as a form of therapy, as a form of trying to untangle all of these emotions of fear and of despair and grief. And they were drawing, some of these drawings had, drawings of children being bombed, and the warplanes had, the flag, the Israeli flag on it, which has the Star of David. And when this artwork was due to be shown around the world, but starting here in California, these Zionist organizations pitched a fit and said that these drawings were anti-Semitic, that these children were bigoted against Jews, and the reason why was because they were drawing the Star of David on the warplanes. That were an accurate reflection of the Star of David that Israel puts on its own warplanes and on its patches on their soldiers and on the flags that they plant on Palestinians' land. And so this real, and just in the last, couple of months, we saw bulldozers in Gaza bulldozing an enormous Star of David into the land. We've seen Palestinian detainees with Stars of David carved into their skin. Just yesterday, I was perusing the news. I saw a young boy in the occupied West Bank who crossed a checkpoint, and one of the soldiers, drew a Star of David on his hand with a pen. So if these are the symbols that Israel has said are a reflection of its people, the only people who they think should be there, the Jewish people, the state of the Jews and Jews only, an ethno-nationalist state. And so when Palestinians are accurately describing the symbols that their occupier are carving into their skin or into their land, or putting on flags that are planted on their houses, that's somehow seen as bigoted or anti-Semitic. It is just unbelievable.
We can show one of those examples, Tamara. I just dropped in the chat. I don't know if it's possible to put up this story from Al Jazeera, which shows satellite images of or aerial images anyway, of Israeli tanks carving the Star of David, this symbol of Judaism, into the land in Gaza.
Yeah, look at that.
And what's the military purpose of that? There isn't one. This is just a show of racial, ethnic, and religious supremacy.
And really just the desecration of symbols like that. I mean, I don't do the as a Jew thing, but as a Jewish person, seeing these symbols as forms of desecration, of supremacy, of oppression and occupation, of apartheid, of genocide, of Holocaust, it disgusts me. And this is Israeli policy. This is Zionism, and it is unforgivable that Palestinians who didn't choose the religion of their occupier. It's not their fault that their occupier happened to be Jewish. That they're just criticized and denigrated and disrespected in this way. It's just despicable.
And here's another story, just because you referenced it, Nora. There may be another one, but this is the one that I recall from, and this is actually from August of 2023. So just a couple of months before the start of the genocide of a Palestinian man who said that Israeli police basically branded or marked a Star of David into his face. And there were photos of that. The Israeli police claimed it wasn't deliberate. It was because basically we kicked him in the face with our boots, and that's what the shape of the shoelaces on the boots did. So the explanation was almost as bad as the accusation, you could say. But there are other examples of this kind of deliberate use, and we saw the TikTok videos, the sort of things that I suspect that the Hint Rajab project has collected in its massive database to go after Israeli soldiers who've engaged in these crimes, particularly the deliberate desecration of religious sites by Israeli soldiers.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you for that. And it's as I said, it's just exhausting to try to have to relitigate this over and over again and over again and deal with the kind of vitriol and just racist double standards in the media, where Palestinians aren't even able to criticize their occupiers. It's just it's horrifying. Let's talk a little bit about New York. What's happening in New York?
Well, just on the theme of censorship, which I think Asa was so right to point out with the BBC film, we have this story from New York where the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, ordered the City University of New York. Remember that the City University of New York is supposed to be an independent academic institution, but apparently the governor of New York could order her to remove a job posting for a Palestinian studies professorship, and called for a probe into so-called anti-Semitic theories. And this story from the New York Post reads, Governor Kathy Hochul ordered City University of New York to immediately shut down a Palestinian studies professorship posting at Hunter College that critics argued promotes hateful instruction that demonizes Israel. The governor also directed CUNY to probe the taxpayer-funded Upper East Side institution, quote, to ensure that anti-Semitic theories are not promoted in the classroom, her office said in a statement. In the job listing, the four-year CUNY College, that's City Universities of New York, stated, quote, we seek a historically grounded scholar who takes a critical lens to issues pertaining to Palestine, including but not limited to settler colonialism, genocide, human rights, apartheid, migration, climate and infrastructure devastation, health, race, gender, and sexuality, end quote. Notice what isn't mentioned in that job posting. There's no mention of Israel. There's no mention of Jews. And yet, so it's about Palestinians. It's Palestine studies. And yet, according to the New York Post, Governor Hochul has directed CUNY to immediately remove this job posting and conduct a thorough review of the position to ensure that anti-Semitic theories are not promoted. Critics said the alarming job description peddles anti-Semitism and is akin to courses offered in the Nazi era, which ascribed all the world's crimes to the Jewish population. I mean, you just heard the language of the job posting as quoted in the New York Post, which surely would have quoted the most damning language they could find from the job posting. Let me read it again, the job posting. We seek a historically grounded scholar who takes a critical lens to issues pertaining to Palestine, including but not limited to settler colonialism, genocide, human rights, apartheid, migration, climate and infrastructure devastation, health, race, gender, and sexuality. And that's what they're comparing to Nazi-era courses about Jews. And what you can conclude from this, first of all, is there is no freedom in the West, or in the United States. The First Amendment is supposed to apply, but apparently the governor of New York can order universities what to do. And the fact that it's a city university should not make this more acceptable, because public institutions like the City University of New York or the State University of New York is where the First Amendment is supposed to be strongest. That's where the First Amendment applies, in public institutions. It doesn't apply in private institutions. Private institutions are allowed to censor people because they're not covered by the First Amendment. Here we have a blatant violation of the First Amendment. And what is the message here? It's that simply to be Palestinian, to talk about Palestine, is now being interpreted as an act of hatred, an act of hostility and aggression against Jewish people. So simply for Palestinians to live and breathe now, or for the word Palestine to be used, or for Palestine to be studied or discussed, is now anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's nothing new. It's just kind of making it more clear. And there is this trend now at university. I mean, this is I think, not the first public university for sure in the US, but maybe in New York to adopt this stance. I mean, the University of California here has banned, basically banned solidarity protests with Palestine. They've put these like enormous bureaucratic sanctions on protesting. You can't wear masks anymore under the guise of, student safety, safety for whom, of course. NYU and Columbia and Barnard have designated Zionism basically as a protected class. And now here at CUNY, I mean, the thing is, though, of course, students involved in organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine are not just taking this and remaining silent. Just yesterday, students at Columbia's sister college, Barnard, in Manhattan, have been leading basically a sit-in protest demanding that the administration reverse course on the expulsion of students because they're involved in Palestine rights solidarity organizing. I mean, if these administrators, are more beholden to their donors and to the research ties with Israeli institutions or politicians, like the governor in New York, and want to take their marching orders from that instead of the students, I think the students are going to continue to put up a huge fight. So it's just kind of more of the same, but I think it's expanding, and the aggressiveness of these administrators working hand in glove with lawmakers who are, more interested in keeping their ties to Israel than actually working on behalf of their constituents or on behalf of free speech principles. It's just getting worse and worse. I mean, I mentioned the Empire State Building going orange for the Bibas children who were killed, most likely by Israeli airstrikes in Gaza. Orange for their orange hair, and really this like fetishization of these two children, who do need to be honored and who deserved a better life, than they got, just as all Palestinian children, all the tens of thousands of Palestinian children, have been denied. And there's just, I mean, New York really revealing its true self there. What do we want to say about the Bibas family and how their story has been exploited and weaponized and used really as a battering ram to whip up more pro-genocide sentiment against Palestinians?
Yeah, John discussed in his report how those bodies were returned, and people can have their own views about it, but it wasn't anything that looked like it was deliberately intending to denigrate them or disrespect them. And the sense seems to be that this family in particular is being used by the Israeli government and by its supporters around the world, particularly in the United States, to whip up a public sentiment that will support a return to the full-scale genocide in Gaza. That's, I think, the significance here. And I think it's significant, as we can see in this reporting from Wyatt Reed and Max Blumenthal at the Gray Zone, that the Bibas family is actually threatening to sue the Israeli government over this official propaganda. And as they report, the relatives of an Israeli family killed while in Hamas captivity in Gaza have demanded the government stop making statements attributing blame for the killings of their loved ones and threatening to, quote, take all legal measures at their disposal if the Netanyahu administration refuses to comply. The request came 3 days after a declaration by Israeli army spokesman Daniel Hagari that Palestinian terrorists had deliberately killed 2 young members of the Bibas family with their bare hands. And I think, as we reported last week, the Bibas family have said that none of the details of how their loved ones died have come from official sources. They did not reveal any of this. In other words, the Israeli authorities didn't reveal any of this to the family. This is all just stuff circulating in the media. And they actually issued a public statement last week asking people to stop repeating these unconfirmed and in many cases purely fabricated details about how their loved ones died.
Including Netanyahu, who's been repeating this trope over and over again, that, again, there was barbaric savages, Hamas strangling the babies to death because they hate Jews. I mean, right. He's been repeating that on stage. Yeah.
And not just him. The Bibas family lawyers say in their letter, which is produced, also you can see it at the Gray Zone, quote, although it is surprising that it is necessary to request and emphasize this, we ask once again, and in every language of request, that all parties be instructed not to contact the family, nor to speak with any professional party entrusted with conducting the examinations regarding the circumstances of the murder and the condition of the deceased. In other words, they're saying, please stop using them as these media talking points. And as the Gray Zone points out, mainstream outlets from USA Today to the BBC have regurgitated the Israeli government's claim that Hamas strangled the Bibas children with their bare hands, prompting centrist hereditary influencer Meghan McCain, she's the daughter of Senator John McCain, to call to, quote, blast the people who killed this baby to hell, referring to the baby Kfir Bibas. So you can see how consent is being manufactured, and there were many examples of that from prominent US politicians. Consent is being manufactured to return to the genocide. And they say that all the indications, as we've said, as John said, is that they were killed in an airstrike. And they point to an analysis by Adar Weinreb, an independent Israeli researcher and former Israeli soldier, who says that an Israeli airstrike was the most likely cause of death for Shiri and Ariel and Kfir Bibas. Quote, this is from the Gray Zone. While Israel claims the Bibas family was brutally murdered by terrorists, a closer look at the available evidence suggests otherwise, Weinreb wrote. Given Israel's history of misleading forensic reports, its established pattern of killing hostages in airstrikes, and the overwhelming lack of precedent for Islamist militants executing young children, I believe the most plausible explanation by a significant margin is that they were killed in an Israeli airstrike. That's the end of that quote from Weinreb. Furthermore, quote, he says, the available evidence does not support the claim that young children were systematically targeted by Hamas. Again, that's Adar Weinreb. He says that on October 7th, children under 13 were killed at a rate approximately 7 times lower than their share of the population, and that children under 5, like the Bibas children, were killed at a rate of approximately 11 times lower than their share of the population. So he says also, among the 80-plus released hostages, the single most consistent testimony is their constant fear of being killed by Israeli airstrikes. Again, that's Adar Weinreb, this Israeli analyst quoted by the Gray Zone. And the latest to do that, Tamara, I put this out of place, and maybe we don't need to show it, but released Israeli captive Noah Argamani spoke at a session of the UN Security Council, and she described surviving an Israeli airstrike on the house where she was held. Let's listen to that clip.
I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I thought it's going to be my last second of my life. I screamed so loud so someone would hear me. And I heard Yossi screaming too. But after a few seconds, I stopped hearing from Yossi.
Yeah, and just to make clear, this comes from about a 10-minute speech that she gave. Of course, I listened to the whole thing to make sure that of the context of what she's saying, and she is describing this airstrike that killed another Israeli captive, Yossi Sharabi, and injured another one called Itai Svirsky, who she alleges was killed by Hamas a few days later. I don't know whether that's been confirmed one way or another. He might have been injured in the airstrike, but she alleges that he was killed. And what's also interesting about her comments, and this sort of takes us into the discussion about the ceasefire, is that her presence there appears to have been sponsored by the Israeli government. From what I can see, she's sitting next to the Israeli ambassador, and even though she's talking about an Israeli airstrike that she narrowly survived and that killed Yossi Sharabi, she gives this very, as you would expect, pro-Israel account. She's not there to express any sympathy for Palestinians whatsoever. And yet, she says that the ceasefire deal has to continue, the second phase has to go ahead, and this is the only way to bring the rest of the captives out. So it's very interesting that the Israeli government is sponsoring or promoting a speaker at the UN who is pushing for the implementation of the full implementation of the ceasefire deal, the same ceasefire deal that Israel is violating in numerous ways, particularly by keeping aid and shelter out of Gaza, tents and mobile homes and so on, and also appears to be undermining in public and stalling the second phase negotiations that, as John has pointed out, was supposed to start weeks ago.
Right. Well, yeah, let's dive into that more. The first phase officially ends March 1st or 2nd, so that's just in a few days from now. And then phase 2 is supposed to be, as Ali said, already underway with discussions. John, what is going on? What can you tell us about where these discussions, where the ceasefire is right now?
The discussions right now that are just beginning are to extend indefinitely phase 1. And so I think, without speculating on where we're going here too much, I think that we're being set up here. I think this was probably clear early on in this process that we're being set up for an extended period of phase 1. The negotiations on phase 2 are significant. They're all the most important issues of the conflict: the full withdrawal, the return of thousands of Palestinian prisoners, many with blood on their hands, as the Israelis say, negotiations that become complicated because of that. Names get added and removed, and those discussions can take a long time. They can take years to do. And so I think we're entering a stage of uncertainty here. And the Trump administration adds such a wild card to it, because Trump just this week basically gave Netanyahu carte blanche: do whatever you want. He would support anything you want. And then his negotiator, Steve Witkoff, does the other thing and says, no, we're very committed to phase 2. We're going to make this happen. Witkoff is to arrive in, I believe he's arriving in Israel, if not Cairo, on Sunday. So 4 days from today. So this is what we're doing. We're doing like negotiations that start 4 or 5 days in the future and then take many weeks, most likely, to come to fruition. And we've watched this happen, I mean, throughout this entire war. These ceasefire meetings, they happen and then they get delayed. And so I think we're about to enter a long period of uncertainty. I think that's my assessment without speculating about the future too much. It's very difficult to see the Israelis right now in this current situation doing the things that are necessary to execute stage 2, and particularly stage 3. Stage 3 is supposed to dovetail with stage 2 to release bodies in stage 3 that guarantee. The whole point is that it's all built on guarantees primarily from the U.S. To make the parties agree to follow through. And the Americans aren't doing that with the Israelis, and the Israelis are taking every opportunity to undermine and to show sort of like, moments of strength. Whereas the Palestinians are doing the opposite. They showed good faith by releasing 6 live prisoners last week, all at once. Those prisoners were supposed to be released next weekend. But they released them early. When the Bibas family confusion, which confirmed that they were killed in an airstrike, the body of the mother was not who was returned to Israel. It was a Palestinian woman who was living in the house with them, and they're blown to bits. They're not intact, and Israel made a big situation about that, as if the Palestinians did that on purpose, right. Which is ridiculous. And Hamas immediately responded to that. They went to the grave. They went to the grave beside the grave of the what they thought was the Bibas mother. The grave beside her was the Palestinian, and so they dug that grave up and immediately sent it to Israel right away. No games, no asking for any, and they did the same with the bodies today. They released the bodies without a ceremony. Israel said no ceremonies, and the Palestinians accepted that. They're not trying to delay the release of their own prisoners. So they have acted in good faith throughout this process, haven't violated it in any way. And Israel's violated it in pretty much every conceivable way. So it's, I think, a real period of uncertainty coming here.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that Israel has been really pushing the boundaries, figuratively and literally, not allowing the aid in that it was supposed to, mandated to let in, including fuel, including construction materials, including tents and the mobile homes, tens of thousands, I think, of mobile homes that they're supposed to let in weeks ago.
60,000.
Yeah.
60,000 in the middle of winter.
Yeah. When people are dying of hypothermia.
Tents that aren't ripped to shreds or cloth. So these were very important parts of the deal that are being reneged upon.
Right. As well as continuing to shoot people around the so-called buffer zone, the no-go zone that Israel keeps expanding inside Gaza. There were, it's just so what kind of enforcement mechanism can be applied here to make Israel adhere to these deals? I mean, that's a rhetorical question, of course. I mean, that's been the question for 80 years, but
well, they need to not get back their prisoners until they're outside of Gaza. I don't see how you can have an exchange, how phase 2 can end with the Israelis still inside Gaza. That's just setting up a situation where the Palestinians give back everything that Israel wants, and then there's no mechanism. Part of this war was to break the siege. Yahya Sinwar said the siege is warfare. So no ceasefire without breaking the siege. That is 𝐓𝐡𝐞's position in this situation. And 𝐓𝐡𝐞's position has not changed since the first day. They're flexible on the details, but not on the core principles. So this means, so if phase 1 is indefinitely extended, does this mean that there will be more exchanges of captives? Not the way it's framed. It would just be an extension of the idea that full-scale war doesn't start again. Right. Which I think is everything but the bombing.
And also an extension of probably Israel not allowing in the aid and humanitarian supplies that it has agreed to allow. And again, this is, nobody's asking it. I mean, we've said this before, and this has to be repeated, that humanitarian aid, supplies, medicine, shelter should never in international law be a subject of negotiation. It's not a bargaining point, because then you're using food and medicine for civilians, for children, for the elderly as a weapon, and that's prohibited. But that's what Israel does by making everything that's Israel is making Palestinians have to negotiate over the release of these captives, because if Israel was not violating the most fundamental basic humanitarian rights of Palestinians in the first place, none of this would be happening. If there were no siege on Gaza, if Israel weren't constantly destroying it and then not allowing people the basic needs to live.
Yeah.
This is a situation Israel could end. Israel could end, and it could have had all these people come home a long time ago.
And
but
still can right now, Ali. They still
can right now.
Hamas
Yeah.
Just yesterday offered again, all for all at one time, all released at one time. This thing could end tomorrow. That is what has been offered. It's on the table tomorrow.
Yeah.
All the prisoners. You release the Palestinians that are in the negotiation, you withdraw from the Gaza Strip, and you allow the borders of Gaza to be open. The war could be over by the weekend.
It's just
That's right. And so as we go into this second phase negotiation, which, as you say, John, hasn't even really properly started, it seems to be that the next sort of sticking point or talking point, which Israel and its supporters are trying to talk up, is the issue of Hamas remaining in Gaza. And we see this manifested in a number of ways. And I'm trying to find, there was a clip just a few days ago. I meant to cue this up. I'm sorry I didn't. Well, Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, was interviewed, and he was asked about whether Hamas would be able to stay in Gaza. And he said that Hamas would physically have to leave Gaza, which it seems like an extraordinary condition to try to impose when Israel utterly failed to achieve that through 16 months of bombing and genocide and attempts to eradicate Hamas, which, as we can see from the videos John showed us, utterly failed. There's still a fully organized national army, basically, in Gaza that is presumably ready to fight again if that is imposed on them. They clearly, Hamas doesn't want a resumption of the war, but they won't shy away from doing what they did for 15, 16 months if they have to. And so we see the flotation of a number of plans again, or a number of stories. Let's maybe look at this story from the Washington Post, Tamara, which is headlined, "Dispute over disarming Hamas bedevils efforts to extend Gaza ceasefire." And just a couple of sentences from this. For 6 weeks, the hard-won ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas survived fraught hostage exchanges, disputes over alleged deal violations, and the shock of President Donald Trump's unexpected proposal to remove Palestinians from Gaza and take control of the Gaza Strip. Then it says, at the heart of the deadlock is the question, could Hamas be persuaded or pressured to lay down its arms and leave Gaza, as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has demanded, as a precondition to ending the war? Or will Netanyahu be willing to compromise and pay the political price? Netanyahu and Hamas leaders, analysts say, face conflicting political pressures, and that may make a second phase agreement far more difficult than the first, and a resumption of war may only be a matter of time. So the idea here is that Hamas is willingly going to give up at the negotiating table what Israel couldn't force them to give up, through 15 months of genocide and bombing, which is the weapons of the resistance. And it's notable that Hamas has said time and again that they are not committed to governing Gaza, that they're willing to agree to all sorts of alternative arrangements for the civil governance of Gaza, for dealing with the infrastructure and reconstruction and so on. Yeah. And that's similar to Hezbollah in Lebanon, where they say, we're part of the Lebanese nation, so we're involved in the politics of Lebanon to the extent that we and our constituents are part of the Lebanese nation, and when we win elections, and that gives us the right to be part of the government and so on, because we're part of the parliament. But we're more than happy for the government of Lebanon to be responsible for reconstruction, to be responsible for securing the territory of Lebanon, for guarding the sovereignty of Lebanon, and so on and so forth. But until that is done, until there is security for Lebanon, we're not going to give up our weapons of resistance, particularly given that there's nothing else to compel Israel to abide by anything it agrees to, and that resistance is a right protected under international law. You can make a very analogous situation to Hamas in Gaza. Are they going to just disarm and make Gaza and make the Palestinian people completely vulnerable, even more vulnerable to Israel? Doesn't seem likely at all.
No, absolutely not. But joining a national unity government is something that Yahya Sinwar has been saying since 2015. That he is willing to do. So this is something that is very doable. And
it's what Hamas did and said after they outright won the Palestinian legislative election in 2006. They had the right, under the terms of the Palestinian Authority Basic Law, to rule outright after they won in 2006. But they said, we're willing to have a national unity government, and they, in fact, agreed to one until that was basically subjected to a coup by Mahmoud Abbas and his cronies, backed by the United States, the United Arab Emirates, and other powers in the region, to basically try to overthrow Hamas's election victory at the time. But let's look at this thing from Yair Lapid, who was in Washington in recent days. I don't know if he's still in the US. He spoke at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which is this ultra far-right neocon Zionist organization, which we've reported on many times at the Electronic Intifada. And indeed, FDD was revealed to be an unregistered agent for Israel, effectively, in Al Jazeera's documentary, The Lobby, which the Electronic Intifada released a few years ago because Al Jazeera refused to do so after they were got out by the lobby, the very same lobby the film was about. That's a story for another day that maybe we should even revisit for the folks who are coming to this issue new. But FDD is one of the most, also the most vocal proponents of war against Iran. And so it's significant that Yair Lapid is speaking here, of all places, and not at something like, I don't know, Americans for Peace Now or J Street or other so-called liberal Zionist groups, because Yair Lapid is perceived as being, you know, an Israeli lefty, almost like a liberal Zionist, member of the peace camp. He's the opposition leader. And so he should be associating with, you know, those who are in line with his type of thinking in Washington, like, as I said, J Street or Americans for Peace Now. But he went to the FDD to make what proposal? That Egypt assume responsibility for Gaza for a period of 8 to 15 years, 8 to 15 years. And in exchange, Egypt's foreign debt of $155 billion basically be paid off by the international community and by regional allies. Those are the terms that he used. And in turn, Egypt would head a regional peace force that would provide governance and launch the process of rebuilding Gaza. Quote, Egypt is a key strategic partner and a reliable ally for almost 50 years, Lapid stated. A strong, moderate, pragmatic Sunni state and a crucial player in the region. So you can see there the sectarianism in this proposal. And so, I mean, one thing that older Gazans will tell you is that one of the worst periods of history in Gaza is the period of Egyptian rule from 1948 to 1967, and not something anyone in Gaza wants to return to, especially given the way Palestinians in Gaza, from Gaza, are treated in Egypt. Nobody in Gaza would welcome Egyptian rule. And that's aside from the fact that I don't think Egypt would be tempted by this at all for its own reasons.
And aside the fact that nobody has asked Palestinians.
Never. But that's the point.
Never. That's like besides, that's
the point. Is that you know, all these same liberals who are saying that, you know, who are so outraged that the U.S. is negotiating with Russia over Ukraine, say nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, nothing about us without us. This kind of slogan that came from, you know, sort of campus left-wing students, you know, saying nothing without us, nothing about us without us, is now being used to justify continuing the NATO proxy war in Ukraine and undermine talks that could possibly end it. But nobody ever says about the Palestinians nothing about them without them. Everyone wants to decide.
They're just potted plants that can be moved around.
Yeah, and
you know,
exactly.
They don't have any agency. What about listen to Palestinian voices?
Nobody wants to listen to Palestinian voices. But the point is that this is all these efforts in the Washington Post, Yair Lapid coming and giving this speech, is an effort to set the agenda and to try to achieve through the ceasefire agreement what Israel failed to do through its genocide, which is impose on Palestinians foreign, either direct Israeli rule. That failed because the Israeli tanks had too many encounters with Yasin 105s to make that viable, and or failing that, to impose collaborator rule through Arab proxies of Israel, which Yair Lapid is repackaging in this form, FDD. But the point here is that I predict, I don't think it's very difficult to predict this, that this is going to be the major sticking point, that the Palestinians are going to be told, you have to surrender.
Right.
What we couldn't take from you by force.
That's right. And that has not ended well for people who have been, directing indigenous people to surrender. Well, that's a good place to wrap. We have so much more we could talk about as usual, but we'll save it for next week. I want to direct people, of course, to the website. As we always do, electronicintifada.net. We have just absolutely incredible features and news posts, analyses. There in the main frame, there is Tamara Nassar's recent feature that she published this morning on what's happening in the occupied West Bank. And the just expansion of violence by the Israeli military and its government, especially the north. So please, 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 please read Tamara's incredible report. We have features from our writers in Gaza. We have I don't have my glasses on, so I can't read exactly who we have there, but please go. One feature that I wanted to point out was by Greg Shupak about the West treats Palestinian men as guilty, and how this kind of trope of, mostly women and children, to elicit sympathy while ignoring the Palestinian men who are also being subjected to the most horrifying violence that Israel can mete out. And he really unwraps that. And I think it's incredibly valuable analysis that people should read.
Yeah, it's such an important point, because the number of women and children killed is indicative of how Israel deliberately targets the civilian population. But it can often be stated in a way that makes it seem as if somehow Palestinian men are legitimate targets and they don't matter. So that's really important. I wanted to highlight one particular feature of the many brilliant features, which is this one. I witnessed worse horrors in Gaza than in Ukraine by Olena Boyko. And Olena is the grandmother of Khalid al-Hissi, who is also one of our regular contributors to the Electronic Intifada. And this is an extraordinary story because Olena is Ukrainian, and she actually was she was a widow living in Ukraine at the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and actually went to Gaza to live with her family. Her daughter, Oksana, this is all described in the story, had married Mohammed al-Hissi, Khalid's father, in the mid-1990s. And Oksana and Mohammed had moved back to Gaza and had a family, number of grandchildren, including Khalid al-Hissi. And then after the war broke out in Ukraine, Olena Boyko went to Gaza to join her family in Gaza, seeking relative safety compared to the situation in Ukraine. And she moved there in early 2023. And she describes how she fell in love with Gaza, how she started a new life from scratch. And she said, I loved how family bonds were so strong. I loved gatherings at Ramadan, the rituals at Eid, the deep love of education that I witnessed, and the profound respect for older people. And then, of course, the horror began after 7 October 2023. And she describes just the absolute horror of living through that and what the family went through, like almost every family in Gaza. But then on top of that, at that time, Khalid al-Hissi was diagnosed in Gaza with blood cancer. And Khalid and Olena, Oksana as I call her, were able to get out of Gaza in November 2023 to Jordan, where they are now, and for Khalid to undergo treatment. And I've met them there many times. I've met Oksana, Babushka, so this story is very close to my heart, and it's an incredible story. And I'm grateful to Khalid for helping his grandmother to write this story. She is a Ukrainian whose native language is Russian, and so we actually, when we speak, we either have Khalid translating for us, or I'm using Google translation because my Russian extends to 2 words. So it's just a remarkable human story, and I'm very grateful to Khalid and to Olena Boyko for writing it. And it's one example of so many stories that we're so proud to feature by our writers in and from Gaza, and I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Ali. And yes, please go to electronicintifada.net to read our features and our posts and our analyses, and also sign up for our email list. If you can and are able, click the Donate Now link to keep this show and our entire publication running. And I just want to thank Tamara Nassar, of course, for directing and producing this program, Maureen Claire Murphy, our senior editor, Michael F. Brown, associate editor, Ellie Gerzon for social media. And on behalf of all of us at the Electronic Intifada, Asa, John, Ali, Tamara, and I, thank you, and we'll see you next week.